You were really packing it in there. Packing it in? Ilishnish's hand went to her infinite haversack. She did not recall adding anything new to it in the past day or so. Yeah, the dwarf said as he nursed his ale. The dishes we sent over during the recess yesterday, or was it 2 days ago? Anyway, it was a lot. You must have eaten enough for 3 whole mining crews. Yes, Ilishnish replied. I hadn't had anything for over a week, so I must have worked up quite the appetite. The mug of ale stopped just before it touched the dwarf's lips, and he gave her a strange look. Ilishnish and the dwarf, a young representative from the merchant guild who went by the name of Khadir Silvershield, were seated at a marble table in the Diamond Plate, one of the dining establishments in the palace quarter. 4 days had passed since her arrival in Fioburkana, and the War Council was on a long recess after completing the conquest of the 3 frost giant citadels to the north of the Dwarf Kingdom. Time was required to clean up the aftermath and reorganize their forces, so Lord Cocytus had declared the one-day break before he and his vassals returned to the Sorcerer's Kingdom to attend to some business there. Ilishnish had opted to stay in the dwarf capital, as she wanted to experience the changes in the city firsthand. On her way out, Khadir had tentatively approached her and offered a tour of the city. After he had shown her around the palace quarter, they stopped at the Diamond Plate, which was situated on the main promenade. Though it was one of the only restaurants open in the quarter, only a third of the tables were occupied. Her gaze drifted over the members of the city's upper crust, dwarven aristocrats, diplomats, and well-to-do merchants who were gathered in meetings of their own. The exquisite garb of the clientele, combined with the rich furnishings and smartly dressed staff, gave the place a refined air that would have probably acted as a barrier against any of the citizens who did not fit in. Ilishnish had only been to such an establishment once, the Shining Golden Pavilion in Nirantal, after a human merchant, who had approached her as she was wandering around, begging to make her acquaintance. It was her first taste of what humans considered the pinnacle of fine dining. Being as sparse and incomprehensible as the flustered merchant's attempts to befriend her, she did not find the food very pleasant. Though it was at the man's expense, the price of the meal destroyed any enjoyment she might have had in the experience. They may as well have just gone to a farm to purchase a herd of livestock, which would have been far more satisfying. If she were to compare the Diamond Plate to the Shining Golden Pavilion, the dwarven establishment was clearly superior. The craftsmanship of the building and its contents could not even be placed in the same realm as its counterpart in Nirantal, and it had a far greater sense of history to it. It was also cheaper and the portions did not look like they were meant to feed a mouse. A stout waitress dropped off another platter of cold meats, and Khadir could only shake his head. "It's funny," he said. "I always thought elves weren't much for meat." "Even snow elves?" "Well, I've never known of snow elves before, but I guess that does make sense. Nothing grows if you live in a frozen place." Ilishnish nodded silently as she took a slice of cured nook and stuffed it into her mouth. Khadir quaffed his ale, looking around surreptitiously before leaning forward. "I hope you'll forgive me for asking, Dame Verilyn," he said in a low voice, "but what sort of work do you do for the Sorceress Kingdom?" "Is that the reason why you approached me?" Ilishnish asked, "to find out what I do?" No, it's more that we line up better." Ilishnish frowned at yet another strange phrase. "Line up better?" "Yeah," Khadir nodded. "If you look at things from a rank perspective, a knight is about where a deputy like myself is. We're at the same social level, so to speak. That being the case, we can speak without needing to resort to stiff formalities. It's more relaxing like that. Also, you're by far the most approachable out of your delegation. No slight intended to the others." "I see," Ilishnish replied. "In that case, I've been granted a knighthood only recently, so not much is going on there yet. As for the rest, I work for the Ministry of Transportation." "The Ministry of Transportation?" Khadir frowned in thought, then swallowed. "You mean you work under that vampire, Minister Bloodfallen? But how did you end up on the War Council?" "The Ministry of Transportation has been assisting the dwarves ever since opening diplomatic relations with the Sorceress Kingdom, yes? We've had far more time to investigate the area than they have." "I see," Khadir said. "So your job was to investigate the region?" "My job is to investigate any region that the Ministry of Transportation desires information about," Ilishnish told him. "Logistics, trade, peoples, laws and customs, all sorts of things. If required, I can also deliver valuable articles quickly and securely from place to place. Khadir nodded slowly at her words, but each nod came more slowly than the one before it. At the same time, a furrow deepened over his bushy black brow. When I'm done here, Ilishnish continued, I'll be preparing for some work in the east. The east? Yes, the Baharuth Empire. I'll be investigating various locations to discern whether the transportation network can profit there. Khadir's expression suddenly reset itself, and he almost looked relieved. Is something the matter? No, the dwarf muttered into his beard. I was just thinking in the wrong direction. For a moment there I thought you were a spy? A short laugh broke through the dull murmur of their surroundings. Khadir straightened in his seat, chuckling nervously as he looked around. No, I didn't think, he sighed as she held his gaze. Yes, that's what I thought. It sounds quite similar, doesn't it? Ilishnish said lightly, you're not the first to think such a thing. You're being quite gracious. Khadir seemed to relax a bit. Most officials don't take well to being called spies. Is that so? Ilishnish stabbed her fork into another piece of meat. Then what shall I do with you? Khadir leaned back, holding out his hands disarmingly. Nothing please, he said. To be honest, the Regency Council's still on edge when it comes to the Sorceress Kingdom. The people have been preoccupied with everything that's happened, but I think they might start worrying too when things start to settle down. When you showed up and started laying out all that information on the map, I couldn't help but wonder how much you knew about our little corner of the world. You understand that the former inhabitants of this city are now subjects of the Sorceress Kingdom, yes? The former. Khadir turned his gaze up at the ceiling. Oh, you mean those frost dragons? You're saying that this information is from them? Could you imagine someone walking all over the Azalizia Mountains to learn all of that? Hey, I guess not. The dragons would have a bird's-eye view on everything, so that would explain a lot. Silly dwarf. Dragons had much better than a bird's-eye view, they had a dragon's eye view. You mentioned something about your people having problems with the Sorceress Kingdom eventually, Ilishnish noted. Why is that? I didn't say that we'd have problems with the Sorceress Kingdom, Khadir said defensively. It's just the whole, the undead. They keep trying to market undead labor to us, and I hear that the Master of Mines and Caves caved in. Supposedly there's a whole team of skeleton laborers being tested out in Fiojura right now. This sounds exactly the opposite of your worries if your people have started to adopt undead labor. Kinda, Khadir said. But you know how it is, especially for people like us. Even when you think things are going well, you have to take a look at your situation from different angles. Aside from the fact that they're, undead, using them for labor has benefits and detriments. Khadir emptied his mug and set it on the side of the table. Within a dozen seconds, the waitress quietly came by to replace it with another foam-topped tankard. He nodded at her in thanks, then returned to the topic at hand. I can see how attractive it is for the Master of Mines and Caves. The lease is cheap, they don't ever tire, and the work itself is dangerous. Old tunnels filled with hazards like gas pockets and flooded sections aren't a problem for a skeleton, and losing them to a collapse or a monster is better than losing lives. And the detriments? Well, there's one big one, and that's us becoming dependent on the Sorceress Kingdom for labor. If we fully adopt the use of undead labor, then we'll expand operations until it's no longer viable. In a generation, our demographics will be different. The people will react accordingly to the shift in demand for labor and the increased supply of ore. At that point, the Sorceress Kingdom can hold us hostage by threatening to withdraw the undead, or worse, they can attack us with our undead laborers. As he spoke, Ilishnish could sense many of the other dwarves nearby turning their attention towards them. She wondered if it was appropriate for him to be speaking of the matter in public. Was this something you came up with? Ilishnish asked. I think most of us in the Merchant Guild can see it, Khadir answered. The Commander-in-Chief still has stars in his eyes after the whole thing with the Quagua and the Frost Dragons, but I know a few people in his staff that understand the problem as well. And how is this different from trade? At least, I feel that it is no different. The Sorceress Kingdom ships great quantities of produce to your nation. Is it not the same problem if these imports of food abruptly cease? If it happened right at this very moment, yes, Khadir replied. But the produce we grow here hasn't been affected aside from the greens that we cultivate down at the bottom of the mountain valleys. With the quagga no longer a threat, those farmers have moved underground to raise mushrooms. The price of mushrooms and mushroom ale in the Dwarf Kingdom have dropped as a result of the cheap imports of grain and liquor from the Sorceress Kingdom, but the Sorceress Kingdom doesn't grow mushrooms. All our mushroom farmers have to do is export their produce. It's actually better this way since mushrooms are more expensive than grain, creating a trade surplus. If food imports stop, then our food exports stop and we can still eat. Khadir took a long draught from his fresh tankard, and Elishnish wished she hadn't asked that particular question. Her head spun from his explanation. Several of the dwarves around the room nodded in agreement with Khadir's reasoning, so Elishnish decided to approach his concerns from a different angle. Fair enough, she said, but I still believe you are still overthinking the issue with the skeleton labor. How so? To be blunt, the Sorceress Kingdom is so powerful that it has absolutely no need for the methods you describe. This sort of scheme requires more effort than simply sending a single, powerful servitor to wipe out your entire nation. Since they have not done that, wouldn't it be more likely that they are acting in good faith? We understand that, Khadir wiped the foam from his beard, but it doesn't stop us from thinking and worrying. Then I would advise you to stop thinking and worrying, Elishnish told him. It is a pointless expenditure of your time and energy. You make it sound as if we can't do anything. That's right, Elishnish said. You cannot do anything, should the Sorceress Kingdom decide to do something. It is the way of things, is it not? When the demon gods came and ruined the lands all around the Azalisia Mountains, when the quagga rose to power, when the frost dragons destroyed Feotivaz and occupied Feoburkana. Your history is filled with events that you could do nothing about. Well, except flee, but I don't think any of your people currently have any desire to do that. Khadir let out a long sigh, unable or unwilling to refute her. Elishnish couldn't understand why mortals so often thought about such useless things. Even dragons did not embark on such ridiculous flights of fancy if they were aware of the superior nature of an adversary. There were plenty of other things to do. I've gone and killed the mood. Elishnish and Khadir turned their heads to the waitress that walked out into the silence that had fallen over the room. Khadir put on an apologetic look. Sorry about that, he said. Didn't think it'd go in that direction. Well, next time keep that talk inside the palace, the waitress huffed. Khadir reached down to his belt, producing 3 gold coins from his pouch. See if some drinks'll help pick things up again. He placed the coins on the edge of their table. Next time, I'll be expecting nothing less than the Stone Princess. Khadir snorted. I think the dame here would have better luck finding her than me. The waitress swept the coins off of the table. Dwarves being dwarves, the atmosphere turned light again at the offer of free drinks. Elishnish turned her attention back to Khadir again. Who is the Stone Princess? That's, well, it's a rumor, I guess, Khadir told her. Dwarves who've gone down to Erantal say that there's a dwarf bard that appears to perform in one of the taverns there. The Frosty Beard, I think that was the name of the place. A dwarf bard. Hey now, Khadir shot her a look, we dwarves have our own bards, you know. Anyway, the thing is that she seems to know more about us than we do, histories, tales, old songs that have been forgotten by our people today. People working in the merchant caravans clamor to make the trip just for the chance to listen to her perform. Strangely, no one knows who she is, not even the tavern owner. I see, Elishnish frowned. But why the Stone Princesses? One of the diplomats that went down there came up with it, Khadir explained. You see, our last king had a daughter, but she was tragically lost when Feoburkana fell. The princess was renowned for her beauty and nobility, plus she was a talented bard. Everyone that's seen the busts and paintings in the royal palace swears that this bard that's appeared in Erantal looks just like her. Following their meal at the Diamond Plate, Khadir continued leading Elishnish around on their tour of the city. The layout of Feoburkana remained mostly unchanged, but the many new buildings created an uncomfortable dissonance with her memory of the place. Aside from the palace quarter, which the quagga had kept intact to serve as dwellings for the most prominent members of their race and their closest followers, the rest of the city had been run down to the point where the dwarves had chosen to level everything and start over from scratch. How long will this new construction be here for? She asked as they walked along the streets of the residential quarter. Is there something wrong with it? I can't help but compare the older buildings in the city with the new ones, Ilishnish replied. I thought that they were perhaps built to serve as temporary housing. Ouch. Khadir winced. That hurts, Dame Verilyn. I can see why you'd ask, though. The buildings that you saw in the palace quarter were fashioned by the great masters at the height of our nation's prosperity. We dwarves of today can't really compare, and it can't be helped. We've been on the back foot since the coming of the demon gods, and survival's been our priority since then. Khadir looked around at the stone houses around them glumly. They were little better than the ones she saw in the villages of Warden's Vale, at least when compared to the buildings in the palace quarter. It's funny, he said. Usually, outsiders only praise dwarven craftsmanship. I guess with the real deal here for everyone to see now, it just shows how far we've fallen. Things are looking up, though, and I think you were right back there, after thinking about it for a bit. About what? Worrying about pointless things, Khadir replied. We've got so much to do, so much to reclaim, that we shouldn't be wasting energy on something we can do nothing about. Merchants make the best of what they have, taking advantage of opportunities along the way, but I guess the aristocrat in me clouded things up a bit. Ilishnish's thoughts turned inwards, flipping through pages of dwarven records. Clan Silvershield was indeed a noble lineage, and its first mention was just under 5 centuries ago. Khadir's house was older than Ilishnish's father, Olisur Dark. Does the rest of the Regency Council harbor the same sentiments? Ilishnish asked. It's split, really, Khadir answered. The one who was most opposed to working with the Sorceress Kingdom was the Forge Master, but he disappeared shortly before we established relations with your nation. In truth, our stance at that point was that it was a beneficial arrangement, so long as we had something to offer that the Sorceress Kingdom wanted. She nodded as he spoke. It appeared that the dwarves were well aware of the need to stay useful to those who held them at their mercy. If that was your original stance, then why did it change? It didn't change, exactly, Khadir said. But it was a stance adopted before we truly knew how stupendously powerful the Sorceress Kingdom was. We entered into negotiations with the mindset that we were dealing with a regular nation, albeit with a few powerful individuals in it, like your king. Without a long war like the one the Quagga waged against us in the past, one regular nation can't force another to terms, even one as small as ours has become. It's generally better to come to some mutually beneficial agreement instead, and the Sorcerer King made it sound like we were joining hands for exactly that. Did something happen that makes you suspect otherwise? No, Khadir shook his head. They're just the worries that rose after reality sunk in. Something like buyer's remorse. But it's like you said, pointless worries. The Sorcerer King came to us for a reason, and I doubt there's anything we could have done to keep him from his objective anyways. Better that we make the best of things. It's not every day a nation gets a chance to return to the glories of old. The tour continued uneventfully, and Ilishnish gained access to all sorts of businesses and other establishments that she would have been hesitant to enter on her own. Going through the remaining 2 quarters was brief, as they were still mostly flattened, and the two soon found themselves back at the royal palace. They parted ways, with Khadir headed off to call upon the next official on duty. Ilishnish returned to the war room, where she found Lord Cocytus standing on his own at the table. Ilishnish took her place at the end of the Sorceress Kingdom's side, and together they stood in silence. Then Lord Cocytus turned his attention to her. She grew nervous under his gaze as the seconds and minutes passed. Why is he staring at me like that? Dame Verilyn. Ilishnish started at the sudden address, then quickly resettled herself. Lord Cocytus. During operations, he said. Your expression, holding back. He had been observing her? It hadn't felt like it. Then again, he had so very many eyes. The War Council appeared to have reached an accord, my lord, Ilishnish said. Far be it my place to present an opposing view after preparations were finalized. Wrong, a blast of frigid air misted the table, fluttering the edges of the map. It is your place. You are an expert. The Azalisia Mountains, the Frost Giants, of those present, you know best. Furthermore, you are a knight of Baroness Zaradnik. Lady Zaradnik? Ilishnish frowned. What does she have to do with all of this? Nothing. But she is a proven commander. She couldn't draw any connections to Lord Cocytus' statement. What did Lady Zaradnik being a proven commander have to do with Ilishnish? She hadn't even known of Lady Zaradnik's capability as a commander. All they had done together thus far was go over the endless rules of human etiquette and an esoteric pile of legal knowledge. "By all appearances, my lord," Elishnish said, "her conduct suggests that she would be in agreement with your tactical procedures. She is quite stern and formal, after all. The both of you are warriors, through and through." "I disagree." "Why you do?" Her battles, have you witnessed?" "I have only entered into her service this past week, my lord." Lord Cocytus raised a claw to his chin. "I see," he said. "Baroness Zaradnik. Not a warrior, but a soldier, first." Elishnish frowned at the odd distinction. What was the difference? Lord Cocytus did not miss her confusion. "Many misunderstand," he explained. "A warrior fights for self, sentiment, ideals, honor and glory, challenge, proof of strength and skill. A soldier serves. Selfish motive, secondary, or cast aside. For a greater cause, they do what they must. In the future, for the army, warriors would be nice. But soldiers, necessary." Now that he phrased it in such a way, Elishnish could see the difference. Unlike the frost giants, who considered themselves warriors, Lady Zaradnik's conduct was that of a soldier. There was little sense of self in her words or actions. Everything was for something else, be it her service to the sorceress kingdom, or the stewardship of her house's legacy. Her beliefs were so strong that she attempted to instill them into everyone around her. Non-humans were not an exception. "If we're to discuss this," Elishnish said, "should at least your vassals be here as well?" "Where did they go, anyway?" "Receiving replacements," Cocytus replied. "Fresh contingents. For the main battle. Between us, I would hear your thoughts." "Then, there is something I'd like to understand first, my lord. Why are our battles being conducted in such a forthright manner? You stated that it is to gain experience for the army and its commanders, but there are surely better ways to go about it." After the Elder Lich had been destroyed while attempting to deliver the Sorceress Kingdom's declaration of intent, a Death Cavalier on a Soul Eater was employed instead. If they were attacked with boulders, and they were, the Death Cavalier would use its skills to defend its mount while they rode away. Following that, they continued their practice of tackling each citadel head-on. The undead contingents would fight their way up to storm the gates, then proceed to clean out the interior. Unlike the first citadel, where they had come across an unexpectedly strong group of frost giants, the other two conquests in the north had been completed with less than a handful of losses each. None of the Elder Lich commanders had been destroyed, as they had taken the information from the first assault to minimize risks in the next two. Problems with the terrain continued, however, with icy footing being the foremost problem. Not only were Death Knights lost by being knocked off of the high ramps before each gate, but maneuvering in combat was difficult. Those acclimated to icy environments, such as frost dragons, had special abilities that allowed them to see through blizzards and navigate frozen terrain. Elishnish could even walk upside down on an icy surface if she so desired. In all, it felt slow and, quite literally, clunky, especially to frost dragons, who were ambush predators who preferred to resolve fights quickly and decisively. The more unfair it was, the better. Additionally, Lord Cocytus and his vassals made their displeasure clear whenever a member of their forces was lost. It was as if they expected a flawless performance from such straightforward tactics. "This war, Lord Cocytus, is subjugation. Winning, not enough. The method is crucial. If the frost giants are, as you say, a warrior people, superiority must be shown, under no uncertain terms." "The subjugation part appears to be missing," Elishnish noted. "Not a single frost giant has survived thus far." "True, but the majority remain. In this next battle, their fate will be decided." "And what fate do you foresee for them, my lord?" Lord Cocytus looked down at the map. In the middle of the three central frost giant citadels were numerous markers signifying the place where the frost giant army had gathered. The Sorceress Kingdom's forces would march southwest from Fioburkana to confront them from the north. "I am conflicted," Lord Cocytus said. "Acts of cowardice. Acts of valor. It is strange. For a warrior people, their spirit is weak. Yet, when it appears, it shines brilliantly. Before these battles, I thought them suited for the army. They are not fragile, like other races. In time, they could earn their place." they still appeared warlike to her. Then again, she had no sense for the sort of thing Lord Cocytus described. Like Khadir Silvershield, Ilishnish was of the mind that, as long as she could maintain her usefulness, she could pursue her own agendas on the side. "I'm no commander, my lord," Ilishnish said, "but if you send a death cavalier in front of this next army, it's probably not going to be able to get away from the hundreds of boulders thrown at it. These frost giants are also gathered for war, so the strongest will be amongst them. Even on an open field, it won't go as well as before. How many troops can you afford to lose?" "As few as possible," Lord Cocytus said, "would be preferable. There are many, but, like elder liches, destruction is permanent. The experience will be lost." "Then why not go yourself? I doubt they could scratch you. Superiority will be proven beyond any conceivable doubt." "That would defeat the purpose," Lord Cocytus replied. "It is a rare opportunity. To squander it, unacceptable for the army. If they are defeated, I will go." Ilishnish wanted to sigh at his stubborn insistence. Lord Cocytus was about as stone-headed as a frost giant when it came to the bounds that they set for themselves. With so much power at his disposal, it only felt like a willful indulgence to her. The vibration of footsteps in the hallway outside informed Ilishnish of the approach of several beings. By their gait, it felt like both the dwarves and Lord Cocytus' vassals were on their way back. "At any rate," Ilishnish said, "if you wanted my opinion on the matter, my lord, it would be to crush the frost giants as swiftly as possible. If you can accomplish this with the forces that you have limited yourself to, then all the better. I believe it to be entirely unnecessary, however. Strength has always ruled these mountains, not warrior traditions or civilized practices." Lord Cocytus' insectoid vassals entered the room, followed by the 5 dwarves from the Regency Council. To her surprise, Lady Shiltir walked in as well. "Cocytus," she said, "if you don't mind, I'll be taking Dame Verilyn with me." He nodded, and Lady Shiltir left the room. Ilishnish glanced at the assembled members, then lowered her head before gracefully scurrying off after Lady Shiltir. As she left the room, the Commander-in-Chief spoke. "Lord Cocytus," he said, "we've been going over some things with your vassals, and I think we've come up with a good way to deal with this frost giant army." Her steps slowed as she strained to hear what he had to say, then she glanced towards the retreating back of Lady Shiltir. As curious as she was, Ilishnish didn't want to be punished for keeping her waiting. "Lady Shiltir," she said as she fell into step beside her, "I wasn't aware that you'd be in Feoburkana." "Neither was I," Lady Shiltir replied. "I was delivering replacement forces for Lord Cocytus. You've behaved yourself, I hope?" "Of course, my lady," Ilishnish said. "Except..." The sound came out so lightly, yet Ilishnish shuddered at its veiled connotations. Her mind worked to produce a suitable reply. "It's the army, I suppose," Ilishnish said. "Lord Cocytus is very honest when it comes to the command of his forces. I understand what he wants, but I don't understand why he wants it in the first place." "That sort of thing should be expected of him," Lady Shiltir replied. "I hope you didn't say anything you shouldn't have." I don't think I did, my lady. I followed Lady Zaradnik's instructions on the matter. The restrictions that Lord Cocytus has placed on the efforts here are, well, they are displeased at the results." "I see," Lady Shiltir said. "Well, Cocytus is a bit new at commanding much weaker forces. I understand that losses are always to be expected in these circumstances, but I've been at it for far longer than he has. He should understand this himself, considering events in the last year or so." "Then why is he upset at the results?" "Because they are His Majesty's servitors, of course," Lady Shiltir replied. "His Majesty may not mind, and may even count it a boon if something beneficial is gained, but it is no excuse to treat any losses frivolously. Anyways, They came out into the courtyard of the royal palace. Ilishnish stared absently at the place where her father's hoard once lay piled high over the stones. Lady Shiltir led her to the side of a dry fountain. It was then that Ilishnish thought that something about Lady Shiltir was off. "Is something the matter, my lady?" Ilishnish asked. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" The intervention that Calistran and her flight had performed during the week suddenly came to mind. Did someone complain? Perhaps Lord Mayor had become cross over yet another incident of her interference in the Adventurer Guild's activities. Ilishnish fidgeted quietly as panic welled up within her. Baroness Zaradnik has gone missing, Lady Shaltier said. Missing? Surely there are spells. All attempts at divination have failed. Something out there is powerful enough to block even Negredo. We've tried locating Lady Zaradnik personally and through her items with nothing to show for it. Even manual scrying turns up nothing. But what does that have to do with me? Lady Shaltier looked up at her strangely. She is your liege, is she not? Actually, do you still feel her influence? Her influence? I'm not sure what that means, my lady. Never mind, Lady Shaltier sighed. The reason why I called you away is to go and look for any sign of her. Calistran mentioned that you came across some adventurers on the way here, yes? Why yes, that's right, Ilishnish edged away slightly. She was participating in that expedition. The ones you ran into survived to reach Fiorizo, but most of their rangers were either found dead or are still being recovered. You're to start your search from there, and inform me if you find something. The sound of pen over paper drifted into the air as Ludmilla nibbled on a piece of jerky. She was taking notes while Gudrun explained another strange aspect of frost giant culture. She ate not because she was hungry, the ring of sustenance saw to that, but because it felt strange to attend a long, sitting discussion without accompaniment. As much as she differed from the other nobles, it was one of the few things that could be said to be the same. She had long run out of tea and biscuits, ate dinner the previous night and was now down to preserved foods. Paper, she had aplenty, and it was piled neatly about her as she learned more and more about Gudrun's people. 2 days had passed since she met the frost giant shaman, and in those days they spent most of their time discussing the culture, traditions and practices of both their peoples. As someone who was presumably going to be performing a diplomatic role during expeditions, she couldn't let the rare opportunity slip by. When Gudrun slept, Ludmilla reviewed her notes. She wasn't certain whether talking for so long was something Gudrun usually did, but the giant did not show any discomfort or restlessness as they conversed. It did not seem as if Gudrun was about to run out of topics to cover, either. A voice at the door interrupted the shaman's ongoing explanation. Gudrun? I'm here. The slab blocking the entrance was shifted aside, and what appeared to be a frost giant adolescent stepped in. She stopped and stared when she noticed Ludmilla. You might pick a fight like that, Auslug, Gudrun said. I'm sorry, Auslug replied. The others wanted to know what was going on. It's been days, and you haven't sent word. Gudrun glanced towards Ludmilla before rising to her feet to address the girl. The warband has not returned, she said. Sigurd is dead. What? How? The girl turned her wide blue eyes to Ludmilla. Are you saying? The frost giant shaman nodded. Then what about mother? Auslug asked. Gudrun wordlessly shook her head. The girl bit her lip, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Seemingly unable to contain herself, she fled from the building. I apologize for her display, Gudrun said after she replaced the door. The girl is still yet young. I don't mind, Ludmilla said. Who is she? One of Sigurd's daughters, Gudrun replied. Ludmilla frowned at the strange distinction. I thought Sigurd was your husband? He was, Gudrun nodded. He also had a daughter by Brunhild. Your best friend. 3 is a sacred number, Gudrun muttered, or so they said. I was Sigurd's wife, and Brunhild was his concubine. No, she was more like his other wife. I'm not sure what to think about that. Short of rare, special provisions, the faith of the Six highly encouraged monogamy amongst their followers. As with the incident involving Moman, the very idea of infidelity made feelings of hostility rise within her. Neither did I, Gudrun smirked. But it happened anyway. We were rivals for his attention, but the 3 of us grew up close. In hindsight, it was not as bad as it could have been. So this is a common practice? It is commonly practiced amongst the strong. Strength is greatly admired and coveted, so I guess I should be thankful that it was just Brunhild and not scores of strange women sharing the same roof as some other men might have. I take it that it is not the same for your people? She couldn't say that it wasn't. Her faith's emphasis on cultivating the potential of humanity made the appeal of a strong partner a matter of course. It was not simply strength, however, accomplishments were valued depending on one's vocation. Be it a blacksmith, a priest, or a farmer, standing at the pinnacle of one's craft made them an attractive prospect for others in the same field. The idea of her sharing someone with Clara rose unbidden in her mind, and she violently shoved it away. It is, Ludmilla replied, to an extent. It would depend on cultural and religious practices. There are a number of human nations, and how things are done may vary greatly. Personally, I might just stab someone if they did that to me. For the first time in Ludmilla's recollection, Gudrun laughed. Her voice boomed off of the walls, and the door rattled against its frame. I have done exactly that in the past, she said, if I suspected that he had lain with some lonely huntress out in the wilderness. It appears that jealousy is another thing we have in common. You do not have a husband, then? No, Ludmilla replied. By the customs of my faith, I am not yet considered an adult. The conversation had taken a strange turn. Why was she discussing marriage with a demi-human in a hut in the middle of nowhere? Not yet of age. Gudrun raised a brow. That is surprising, considering what you've accomplished. Your strength must be a rarity amongst your people. It probably is, Ludmilla said. I don't feel that it's my doing, however. I have inherited much from both my father and my mother. The way of my people has some similarities to your own, but our matches are not solely by caste. Bloodlines are cultivated between members of the same vocation. I see, Gudrun nodded. But that is the way of the world, is it not? Strength breeds strength. Also, you are too humble by far. If you speak with frost giants, not boasting when the opportunity presents itself would be considered rude. Your parents must surely do so if they have a child such as yourself. Ludmilla felt a lonely smile creep its way onto her face. I'm not sure that they would, she said. Humility is a virtue in my family's culture. Boasting and complaining are frowned upon. I would be satisfied if they were simply proud of me. They're not. Everything I accomplished happened after their deaths, Ludmilla told her, so I may never know. I see, Gudrun said a bit too jovially. Tell me of their fate. Yet another strange turn. Was it simply their way? They clearly grieved the passing of friends and family, but how they addressed death was unlike anything she knew. They welcomed, no, celebrated those who met a worthy end. My mother died when I was half my current age, Ludmilla said. A tribal champion appeared at the borders of our territory, seeking a challenge. My mother and her patrol fought the champion and its warband. In the end, the warband was destroyed, but only half of the patrol returned. A good fate. How about your father? He was called to war half a year ago by our former liege. It was an annual conflict with the Baharuth Empire, the human nation to the east of these mountains. This year, however, they were fighting against the Sorcerer King. Our army was shattered. My father and both of my brothers, along with many of our best fighting men, were slain. Gudrun nodded at her words, then furrowed a brow partway through Ludmilla's account. The Sorcerer King? She asked, the same ruler of the Sorceress Kingdom who you now serve? The same, Ludmilla nodded. The territory that was taken as a result included my family's land as well. So did some valorous deed by your sire or brothers earn this Sorcerer King's recognition? So outstanding that you were not enslaved? Ludmilla couldn't help but frown at the giant's odd interpretation of the outcome, but Gudrun's question gave rise to a number of her own. What did the Sorcerer King think of the duchy's nobles? How did he view the deaths of their loved ones in the Battle of Katza Plains? She had never once spoken to the Sorcerer King, nor had she ever seen him in person. By the accounts of the citizens, he walked the streets of Irantal occasionally, but the majority of Ludmilla's time was spent in her distant domain. That's not how it works with our people, Ludmilla said patiently. The subjects of a territory, nobles included, come with that territory. When ours was annexed, we became subjects of the new owner of that territory through formal procedures. This way, battles can be fought in designated locations and the productivity of the land is not lost through destructive conquest. It does not always mean that devastation can be avoided in a protracted war, but it is the ideal. Interesting. So if my tribe challenged another tribe to a war and won, the other tribe would lose their territory. If the outcome was clear, yes, it might be a simple way to frame it. In the past few days, Gudrun said, you made it sound as if contests of strength were not practiced in your nation. Gudrun's tendency to turn the conversation towards the frost giant's way of seeing the world should have not come as a surprise after exchanging information for so long, yet it somehow still did. If they were integrated into the Sorceress Kingdom, or at least entered into amicable relations with them, Ludmilla wondered where they might find a place for themselves. Our nation was indeed founded through a contest of strength, Ludmilla replied, and the demi-humans living there have also submitted themselves to the Sorcerer King's strength. In my time so far as a noble of the Sorceress Kingdom, however, this strength has been used to provide security and uphold order. When it comes to foreign relations, other forms of diplomacy and trade are preferred. This is strange to me. I have a frost dragon vassal that often says the same. Truly? Well, this is no surprise, it is the strong who rule our world. Hello? Lord Mayor's voice popped into her head, and Ludmilla nearly jumped out of her seat. She held up a hand to Gudrun, unsure if she would understand what she meant, then turned to face a nearby wall. Good evening, Lord Mayor. Oh. You're alive. I was just wondering. Was there something you required of me, my lord? No, I was just curious. The diviners couldn't locate your guild tag for recovery. Ludmilla furrowed her brow at his words. That's strange, I don't think I've done anything on my end. Oh, you may be pleased to know that I've been learning about the frost giants for the last few days. There's going to be quite a bit to go over after this. Really? That's great. Come back when you're done, I guess. Will you be informing the expedition? No, I don't think I will. They're still out doing recovery work, so I'll let them continue until everyone else is accounted for. I see. Was there anything else I can help you with? No, just checking in. Thank you for your kind concern, my lord. Have a good evening. The message spell ended, and Ludmilla returned to her seat. Apologies for the interruption, she said. A superior just contacted me via spell. A spell? Gudrun raised an eyebrow. I've not heard of such a spell before. Perhaps you will have the opportunity to learn in the future, Ludmilla told her. You may even have spells of your own that none of the tribes in our nation possess. It may be interesting to see what the shamans of other tribes use. Gudrun's voice trailed off. Her gaze went past Ludmilla's shoulder. Hi. Ludmilla turned to see Ilishnish, in her snow elf appearance, scurrying out of the building. Wait, what in the world are you doing here? Ilishnish froze in her tracks and looked over her shoulder. Her eyes went up fearfully to Gudrun, then back to Ludmilla. Lady Shiltir sent me to find you, Ilishnish said. She said you went missing. Your scent was coming out of this hut, but Lord Mayor contacted me just now? What? Do you know how long I've been flying around for? Flying? Gudrun's question elicited a frightened squeak out of Ilishnish. The frost dragon moved to hide behind Ludmilla's shoulder. Allow me to introduce you. Ludmilla turned to address Gudrun. This is Ilisn'=Verilyn, the frost dragon vassal I mentioned before. It is a draconic name. Gudrun leaned forward curiously, but she looks a bit small for a dragon. She's a bard that has learned to weave spell song to assume alternate appearances. Gudrun leaned back again, stroking her chin. Frost dragon, bard, this is quite a surprise. To think that the frost dragon that you spoke of was Fimbulvetr. You must be a mighty huntress indeed. I'd rather you not call me that, Ilishnish huffed. It makes everyone think I'm some sort of horrible monster. Fimbulvetr. Ludmilla awkwardly mouthed the word. What does it mean? The great, terrible winter, Gudrun explained. The long winter that kills all lesser beings, assailing them from every direction. The winter that comes before the end of all things, after which even the giants, dragons and gods will meet their fate. It felt like a good name for a frost dragon. At least she thought so. It's a baseless name. Ilishnish complained. What did I do to deserve it? It does fit, in a way, Gudrun said. Especially for those that named you. You have a reputation for culling away the weak and the foolish. How many hundreds of frost giants have met their end at your claws? Hundreds? Ludmilla looked over her shoulder. It just adds up. Ilishnish said, a couple here and there over a few decades. Anyways, Lady Shiltir told me to contact her when I found you, so I'll be going to do that. Ilishnish started to slink away towards the exit again. Shouldn't you have a few message scrolls? Ludmilla said, for that matter, why didn't you just contact me? Damn it. Why didn't I think of that? Why didn't Lady Shiltir think of that? All this time looking for you. The frost dragon muttered darkly to herself as she reached into her infinite haversack. She retrieved a scroll, which was subsequently consumed in a burst of azure flame. A few moments later, Elishnish looked back towards them. "Lady Shiltir is coming," she said. "Right now?" Ludmilla asked. In response, the black portal of a gate spell opened several meters away. Lady Shiltir appeared, adorned in her crimson plate armor, pipette lance gleaming in her hand. Ludmilla lowered her head at her liege's entrance, and Elishnish followed suit. "Lady Shiltir," Ludmilla said, "you honor us with your presence." "You have become a very difficult person to find," Lady Shiltir said. "I think Lord Mayor mentioned something to that effect," Ludmilla replied, "but I'm not sure why that is." "You spoke to Mayor?" "Yes, my lady. He contacted me with a message spell not 15 minutes ago." A complicated expression clouded Lady Shiltir's face. Given Elishnish's reaction, Ludmilla decided that it would be wise to stay silent. "Is that so?" Lady Shiltir visibly worked to recover her mental balance. "So you've been here all this time, sitting with—" "She is called Gudrun, my lady." "Gudrun? Next, you're going to tell me that there's a Sigurd here too. You knew?" They frowned at one another for a long moment. Ludmilla cleared her throat to make a proper introduction. "Gudrun," she looked up at the frost giant, "I have the pleasure of introducing you to, Gudrun." The frost giant across from them appeared deaf to her words. She stared down with wide eyes towards Lady Shiltir. Are you a Valkyrie?" Gudrun breathed. "I am." Lady Shiltir peered up at her, "But how do you know this?" "Our lore, our lays and sagas, they describe your appearance." Lady Shiltir looked at Ludmilla. Ludmilla could only shake her head unknowingly. "Is that so?" Her liege turned her attention back to Gudrun. "I would hear you recite what you know." Gudrun rose to her feet, licking her lips nervously. Focused as she was on their customs and everyday practices, Ludmilla had not yet covered the frost giant's lore and mythology. Gudrun's recognition of Lady Shiltir came as a complete surprise. The giant's voice had a tentative quality to it that was unlike any used in the past few days. The segment that followed came out in reverent tones. "High under helms, on heaven's field, their burnies all, with blood were red, and from their spears, bright rays shone forth. Charm species. Lady shall, quiet." Ludmilla stilled her voice. A deadly edge had entered Lady Shiltir's demeanor, something she had witnessed only once before. It was when they started planning for the transportation network, and they discussed the strange language used in her notes. Lady Shiltir's metallic heel sounded over the ice as she walked up to Gudrun. "Now, Gudrun," she said, "you will tell me how your people came to possess this lore."